Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Parker. I'm senior fellow here at the Shorenstein Center on the Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. We're scheduled today to talk with Tim Alberta, a staff writer for the Atlantic Monthly, and until recently, a highly acclaimed writer for POLITICO. He came to national attention in 2016 with a terrific book called American Carnage, which is probably the best inside documentation of Donald Trump's campaign to become the Republican nominee and then to become president. So I commend to all of you American Carnage by Tim Alberta. We have one minor problem. Tim got in touch with us 30 minutes ago to say that his wife has suddenly fallen very ill and that he therefore was trying to arrange babysitting coverage for his two small children. We've now worked it out so that he is going to be joining us, but he's going to be joining us about 10 minutes late. So Tim is going to be in this discussion. I will be interviewing him, but it will start 10 minutes late. What we've decided to do, have Tom Patterson, the Bradley professor here at the Shorenstein Center, and the author himself of a terrific book on the Republican Party, join us to set the ground for the discussion that is going to start in approximately 9 minutes, assuming that Tim's family issues have been fully worked out. So what I'd like to do is first go through the housekeeping and say, we are recording this, and I hope you're all good with that. If you are concerned about your appearing in the video recording of this, we ask that you turn off your video. We don't have other means for blocking or screening you. And then third, that we will open this up to questions, and you should be prepared to put your questions into the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as absolutely possible. And then finally, we're running late. We understand that, and so we're prepared to run a little bit late on the backside as well too. So thank you all for indulging us about this. Sorry about home front crisis for Tim, but very appreciative that he does plan to join us and is simply running a few minutes late. So let me turn now to my colleague, Tom Patterson, who is one of the finest political scientists and theorists that we've got on the faculty here at Harvard. And Tom has recently published a first-rate analysis of the current situation of the Republican Party and its prospects for the future. And Tom, I was hoping that you and I could talk for a few minutes about your own reading of where the Republican Party is today and where it's headed. So, Tom, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think in the near term, the Republican Party isn't necessarily in trouble. It's usually nice to be the out party when you come up to a midterm election, and the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate are about as thin as they can be. So it wouldn't be all that surprising if the Republicans took back one or both chambers of Congress in 2022. Now, Democrats are doing everything they can to try to stop that, but there's plenty of historical precedent if that should happen. But I think if you look down the road, the Republican Party is in deep trouble. And in the book, I talk about 5 traps that the Republican Party has set for itself. One is by positioning itself too far to the right for a two-party system. If you look at the 2020 election, Biden won the independents by nearly 3-2. And they're the balance of power in American elections. The Republicans have really pushed themselves out to the edge. The right-wing media are usually talked about as a plus for the Republicans, but one of the things that they do is they anchor the orthodoxy. You can't deviate, you can't moderate, and a party that can't moderate in our system is in trouble. But I think the biggest trap is the demographic trap. I think for most of the audience, the most familiar, of course, is the heavily level of support that the Democrats get from minorities, and they're a growing part of the population. But to me, one of the most telling indicators of the futures of our two parties is what's been happening with young voters. In the last 5 presidential elections, the Democrats have won the votes of those 29 to 18 by roughly low 60s to the high 30s. That's happened 5 times in a row. And that now includes everybody that's under the age of 44 and eligible to vote in the US. And if you look at the 2020 election, that group went about 57 to 43% for Biden. It was the older voters who went for Trump, and the Republican Party is aging out. Now, the importance of doing this 5 times in a row is, if we go back historically to what made the New Deal coalition, what allowed the Democrats to dominate our politics from the 30s through the end of the 60s. It was in the 32, 36, and 40 elections where young voters voted overwhelmingly Democratic and stayed loyal to the Democratic Party through their lifetimes. They were the bloc that carried Democrats to victory election after election. And I think that's what we're going to see in America again. We're going to see this wave of young voters that we've seen over the last 5 elections stick with the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is aging out. And sure, simply the march of age is going to really work against the Republican Party. There isn't much polling on teenagers. What there is says, if anything, they're even more Democratic than the group just above them in age. So there's another small army of Democrats in the wings ready to come on board. And I think the Republican Party, by almost every measure you look at, is in trouble in the long term, if not the short term.
Tom, thank you. Let me ask you a question, which is perplexing me. Is it possible that this could be the death knell of the Republican Party as a viable presidential party, but that it remains a powerful congressional party and state and local party, given the structure of American politics? Is that a possibility? How do you see that?
No, I think in the short term, that's a real possibility, Richard. The Republicans have been much better than the Democrats about targeting local and state elections. They started this in the 1990s, and the Democrats are only now beginning to think maybe we should be doing that in a large way, but they've been doing this for a couple of decades. And you can see the effect in the 2020 elections, where Republicans did very well in state legislative races, and they control most of the states. They have unified control of most of the states where unified control is, almost 2 to 1 over the Democrats. Now, another group of states where we have divided control, but the Republicans are really strong at that level. And then when you look at how they're distributed, if you look at the congressional districts that the Cook political report identifies as strong or leaning Republican, more than 60% of those are in the southern or border states. And they've got such a stronghold on that region that it's unimaginable to me that that's going to weaken all that soon, notwithstanding what happened in Georgia.
Tom, thank you. This has been a great introduction. I can see out of the corner of my eye that Tim Alberta has joined us. Tim, I want to thank you, particularly under these circumstances. Tom, thank you so much for coming in at the last minute and setting up this conversation with Tim so ably. I really,
it's a real pleasure. You know, it's not like being the intro band for the Rolling Stones, but it's darn close. So I've been able to do a little bit of
share, right?
Thanks so much, Richard.
Yeah. Thanks. All right, yeah. Tim, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone, and I'm sorry to be a few minutes late here. Everyone's got their own COVID-19 vaccine story these days, and I suppose we are no exception. My wife and I just got our second shots yesterday, and very abruptly this morning, my wife fell quite ill very abruptly, and so I've got 3 little ones running around the house like chickens with their heads cut off, and I needed to arrange for childcare very quickly. So I'm sorry to be a few minutes late.
We're delighted you could join us. And for all of us who are parents, we fully understand. And for all of us either waiting for our next shot or having recently completed it and having come down with a high temp and a aching body, welcome to the world of recovery. So we hope that everything goes smoothly from here on out. So Tim, I'm not going to summarize your biography. It's a stellar biography as a journalist for what you've accomplished in so young a journalist. What I want to do is really get right into this discussion. For those of you who want biographical details about Tim, it's on the webpage for this program today. The highlight simply is that he has just recently become a staff member for the Atlantic Monthly after a stellar several years at Politico, and he has written widely across the board and is one of the most respected young political journalists in Washington today, and most interestingly, has decided to move to Michigan to be a stellar Washington journalist. So, Tim, what I like so much is American Carnage, fabulous book on the 2016 election and Donald Trump's part in that election. But what I'm looking forward to is hearing from you about the experience of being out in the country during this entire 2020 process and what it's telling you both about the future of the Republican Party, but about the future of the Democrats and of democracy, which all seem at times up for grabs. So please go.
Well, boy, there is an awful lot to unpack, and I'll try to do it as efficiently, as concisely as I can, and leave lots of time to have a conversation with all of you folks. And, you know, just as a point of personal privilege, this is pretty cool for me. I'm a community college kid who sort of stumbled my way into one lucky break after another in life and in career. So to be chatting with a bunch of folks at Harvard is a little bit surreal for me. And so I'll try my best to keep my big boy voice on and act like I belong here with all of you. You know,
Tim, you belong, so don't worry about that.
You know,
universal.
To your point there a moment ago, Richard. Yeah, you know, I had decided, actually, while I was writing my book, I had decided that I wanted to move home to Michigan, where I grew up, and cover the 2020 campaign from the ground up. And it just occurred to me, you know, that there were a lot of these sort of very theoretical conversations after the 2016 election about how did we miss this, right? Why didn't we see this coming? Why are we sort of out of touch with the middle of the country and with a lot of these states that were a part of the blue wall for decades, and that suddenly Trump was able to flip from blue to red? And you know, those conversations were in and of themselves quite encouraging. And yet I found myself in sort of early to middle 2019, looking around my newsroom at Politico, looking around a lot of big newsrooms where I have friends and colleagues and competitors. And we weren't really doing anything differently. We were quite frankly covering 2020 the exact same way that we'd covered 2016. And so it had been on my mind while writing the book to try and move home, and for some family reasons as well. We just kind of wanted to escape DC. And so we made a pretty quick snap move out of it, and we got back to Michigan in the fall of 2019. And so I spent the next 15 months really covering the campaign from the ground up, and just putting a lot of miles on the car and driving all around Middle America, trying to get an understanding not just of, you know, this mythologized you know, working class Rust Belt voter in the diner off the interstate who's down on his luck, but to also understand what's happening with Black voters in Detroit, right? What's happening with upper middle class white voters in the suburbs north of Milwaukee? What's going on with Hispanic voters in Arizona, and in particular with young Hispanic voters who have been low propensity for generations, right? Trying to understand and unlock some of these mysteries on certain demographic groups and how they were responding, not just to the candidates, but to the parties and to some of the sort of broader cultural battles of the time. That's really where I wanted to spend the bulk of my reporting time in 2020. And it might not have made for the sexiest headlines or the most tweet-worthy or click-worthy articles, but it was enormously rewarding. And in fact, at the end of the election cycle, I was reviewing some of the pieces that I had written, which we called letters to Washington. Of course, the New Yorker always had its famous letter from Washington, and we sort of turned that on its head. And I wrote these dispatches from around the country called letters to Washington. And it was actually pretty remarkable when we went back at the end. My editors were packaging it all together for some award submission thing, and it really was pretty neat to see how a lot of that reporting from the ground wound up aligning with a lot of what we saw on election day, and not only on election day, but then in the subsequent 2 or 3 months after election day, namely with a large portion of the Republican voting universe refusing to accept the legitimacy of the result and believing that President Trump had been cheated out of office, believing that the institutions of government had been rigged against the Republican Party. And all of that could be seen throughout the previous 12 to 15 months in my time on the ground. So then to see it all come into fruition, as alarming and discouraging as it was, it also sort of made sense in its own way.
So let's talk about what you learned that are the 2 or 3 deep connections that you made. I'm very interested. I grew up in California, but my parents were from the Midwest. I spent a lot of time in Iowa and Ohio in the 50s and 60s, and I've never had a sense that the press in Washington, New York, or Boston, or Los Angeles has a feel for that world. And I'm interested to see what you have as your feel, having grown up in it and having chosen to go back to it.
Richard, I guess I would start, and this is not necessarily in order of importance or even relevance, but I would start with this basic question that we've been grappling with for 2.5 centuries in this country of race and the role that it plays in our politics. And I have been myself sort of looking back over this past 10 to 12 years of politics, and particularly of Republican politics, and feeling ever more convinced that race was playing a larger role than we were ever necessarily comfortable acknowledging. And in fact, I was just having a conversation with Speaker Boehner about this the other day, who of course is in the news right now for his own book release, but I've covered him about as closely as anyone over the last decade, and we've had a lot of long conversations about this. And that was something he said to me, was that, in the moment, you just want to believe that these are sort of one-off things. Sure, there's a couple of, crazies who think that Barack Obama was born in Kenya. Sure, there are a couple of crazies who think that Huma Abedin is actually a splinter cell worker for the Muslim Brotherhood. Sure, there are people who make some insensitive comments about immigrants or about welfare recipients, but those people don't represent the mainstream. And in fact, if we've learned anything in the past, I would argue 4 years, but in particular over the last, I think 18 months, it's that there can no longer be any real distinguishing between the mainstream of Republican politics and the fringe of Republican politics. That much is just abundantly clear. And I think that there are several different windows into that conflating or that blurring, because conflating would suggest that it's unintentional, and I'm doing it quite intentionally. But I think race is central to it. I do believe that issues of immigration in particular, but some other issues as well, as far as welfare reform and even taxation, those issues were once seen as perhaps very subtle proxies for Republican voting attitudes, voting behaviors on race. And I think that they are much better understood now as sort of direct lines to those things, not just sort of vague representations or proxies, but really they can give you a very direct window into Republican thinking. And I want to be clear, whenever I give one of these talks or whenever I'm on a panel of some kind, I always try to step back and emphasize this very simple point that surely all of you appreciate. I don't believe necessarily that these views on race or on some of these other things that I'd like to get to if I spare myself a moment, I don't know that they are as indicative of the attitudes of the Republican governing class as much as they are indicative and representative of the Republican base and Republican constituents. And I think that we oftentimes overlook the fact that these folks, at least in the House, they are called representatives. That is their job title. And if you are to travel into any number of these 200 or so Republican-held congressional districts, and if you recognize that in your average off-year congressional primary election, which is tantamount to a general election in those deep red districts, that you're seeing between 8 and 12% turnout of eligible voters, that's a voting universe in some of these districts of 25 or 30,000 people. And when you spend time with some of those groups that represent that 25 or 30,000 people, and you talk to them about issues of immigration, issues of social justice and racial justice and mass incarceration and Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter and defund the police, if you start to unpack some of these issues with the core of these constituencies in these Republican-heavy districts, you walk away with a very clear understanding of why their representatives in Washington are willing to act and talk and conduct themselves in a certain way. So that's a very long, winding answer I'm giving you there, Richard, and that's just focused on the racial component of it. But I would very quickly add to that I think the other thing that we cannot overstate, and it's incredibly difficult to quantify, is just this feeling of long simmering resentment toward the elites in this country. And it manifests itself in so many different ways. And you can look back at any number of different inflection points along the way in modern American history. For me, I think 2008 and the convergence of the bank bailouts and Sarah Palin's emergence as this sort of Tea Party martyr in the Republican Party, and then the election of the first Black president. Those three events all sort of sequenced in a matter of about 3 months in late 2008. I think that period of time, and I wrote about it, quite a bit in my book, but not nearly enough. Frankly, there could be an entire book just focused on that 3 or 4 month window of time, Richard, because I believe that was really what lit the fuse of this incredible amount of grievance and resentment, some of it manifesting itself racially, certainly culturally, but also socioeconomically. There are so many folks in this country who believe, whether they vote Republican or Democrat, or whether they don't vote for anyone at all, who clearly believe that no matter who's in power, that Washington and Wall Street and powerful, well-connected, wealthy people in this country have essentially stacked the deck against them, and that they are all getting ahead at their own expense. And that was, I think in a large sense, the lifeblood of the Trump candidacy and of the Trump presidency, this idea that he was going to stick it to the special interests and that he was going to fight for the everyman who did not have anybody in the arena sort of battling on their behalf.
That's a terrific point, and I think it's important for people here in Cambridge to listen carefully to what you're saying. I try to remind my students that if you want to talk about political bubbles, in 2020, Cambridge voted 52,000 for the Democratic candidate and 3,000 for the Republican. So we are very definitely in a bubble of deep blue, and Tim's ability to bring a closer awareness of the variety of identities that are holding together that Republican base, I think are very important. Let me ask you a question that was a commonplace assumption among political scientists 40 or 50 years ago, which was that region is really important here. The South has been for over a century and a half, a unitary bloc that has the distinction of having switched parties, but not having switched its unitary characteristic in terms of party support. How do you think there's still something differentially important between the South and the non-South in terms of this Republican base you're talking about?
So that's a great question. What I would say is that I don't know that I don't know that you would look at the voting South of the 1980s or 1990s and view it as sort of dramatically different from what we see today. I certainly think that some attitudes have hardened around some of those core sort of cultural issues, but I also think economically there is perhaps a greater willingness today than there had been before to vote against economic self-interest because of those core cultural issues, if that makes sense.
No,
You see that in certain pockets of the country, but I do believe that you see it most readily in the South. And I think, Richard, speaking regionally, I think that the central component of this electoral realignment that we are living through right now is happening in the greater Midwest, because what you are seeing here is not only along class lines, not only along ethnic lines and racial lines, but you're actually seeing something of an intersection, and that's probably not the most articulate way to phrase it. And let me explain what I mean. What you're beginning to see here in the past two elections, and particularly in 2020, you are beginning to see more and more folks identify with a party based on a socioeconomic and or a cultural affiliation, and oftentimes those two are tied quite closely together, regardless of their racial affiliation, racial identification. That's something that we've seen in the Midwest in a way that we haven't necessarily seen at any real scale in other parts of the country. So we've seen in Detroit, we've seen in Milwaukee, we've seen in Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati, we've seen it in Pittsburgh, to a lesser extent a little bit, we've seen it in Pennsylvania. You will see now more voters willing to, you will see more working class minority voters willing to cross over and vote Republican, even if it's just marginal. We know from these last two elections that the margins mean everything, right? Trump wins Wisconsin by 20,000 votes in 2016, and he loses Wisconsin by 20,000 votes in 2020. I mean, those margins are what we're dealing with. And when you see Trump performing at a marginally but significantly better clip with working class Hispanics and working class Black voters in some of those cities, that's quite meaningful. At the same time, when you see Biden performing quite a bit better with well-educated, affluent, two-car garage, college-educated white voters in the suburbs of Oakland County or Waukesha County or Philadelphia County, Berks County, when you see that as almost the inverting, the inverse sort of manifestation of this realignment, you're not seeing nearly as much of that in other parts of the country. You see it in sort of fits and spurts. But so for my money, and I guess I'm a bit biased in this perspective, but these last two elections in the Midwest, 2016 and 2020, these are the elections I think that folks in your profession and folks in mine will probably be studying for some years to come, because there is something, I think, sort of intersecting, as I alluded to a moment ago, sort of intersecting at the economic and the cultural. And both of those identifiers are not sort of breaking cleanly along the lines that they would have used to, I think in part because some of these voters will now tell you that they feel that even if one party's platform, one party's policy positions more neatly align with their own, that they feel like they do not have an identity in that party. And that in and of itself is an extraordinary dynamic to try to unpack, and every voter means something a little bit different by it. But I can just tell you from my own experiences that the number of Black and Latino voters who I've spoken with over the last 15, 18 months, who told me that they no longer really feel welcome in the Democratic Party, or they certainly feel taken for granted by the Democratic Party. You hear that a lot from African-American voters in particular. that is sort of one bucket over here that's driving some of this realignment slowly but surely. And then in the other bucket, you have a really, I think for the Republicans, a startling number of lifelong GOP voting, college educated suburban voters who for the first time have voted Democratic because they no longer want the social affiliation that comes with being a Republican.
We haven't used the word religion, and religion, organized religion, has played an enormous role historically in American politics, and it clearly played a very significant role in creating the Reagan era and beyond Republican Party that we're encountering. And yet Falwell and Robertson are effectively gone. There is no single big entity like the moral majority anymore. Has organized religion's role receded? And is that partly a function of the seeming decline of organized religion, which we're hearing so much about? How does that play out in the Midwest?
You know, boy, that's an interesting question, because there are two answers that might sound contradictory, but really they dovetail together and are, I think, parts of a whole. So on the one hand, I believe that the influence, the political influence of organized religion as sort of a galvanizing institution is without question on the wane. At the macro level, right? At the micro level, actually, what you see happening in the individual churches, in the pews, in this sort of regional church organization, and I'm actually working on my first great opus for the Atlantic magazine on this very subject at the moment. You actually see an incredible amount of sort of tribal identification within the church now that correlates directly to politics and not to some of the peripheral political issues, single issue voters on abortion, single issue voters on same-sex marriage. No, this is a broader affiliation born out of their church affiliation, and it is wrapped up in patriotism. It is wrapped up in a sense of sort of the culture under siege more broadly, a disrespect for police and for authority figures in general, a feeling that the public schools are indoctrinating their children from the left. So it's interesting, Richard, because if you were to talk to leaders in the church who have been active politically 15 or 20 years ago, they would tell you that probably, 70%, give or take, of their congregants in the evangelical white Christian church were reliably voting for Republican, but for these very narrow reasons, right? That there was almost you could draw a pretty straight line between what they were hearing on Sunday mornings, what they were discussing in their small groups, Bible groups during the week, and then how they behaved at the ballot box. What they'll tell you now, 15 or 20 years later, is actually the number of those voters and their sort of tribal political loyalties has increased significantly, that now you're seeing 80 to 85% of those voters vote for that one party, but they're doing it for different reasons that are much less narrow and much more, it's tough to characterize, but there's the way that I describe this to some people, Richard, is Mike Pence, the former vice president, his bread and butter line for many, many years, when he would introduce himself to crowds, some of you may have heard this, Mike Pence would famously say, "I'm Mike Pence, and I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order." And people would go crazy. They'd give him a big applause, right? And when you spend time in the modern evangelical church, of which I have done an awful lot, just in my personal life and in my professional life, it has almost been completely inverted in the last 10 years to where now people, when you will get into these conversations with them, they will identify as Republicans, conservatives, and Christians in that order. And I think that's driving a great deal of the sort of blind loyalty to Trump. And frankly, I think some of the some of the behavior that you see coming from the sort of, as I said earlier, the organizational structure is not there in any meaningful way, the way that it was 20 or 30 years ago. And yet somehow at the grassroots level, it's far more potent, far more, dare I say, vitriolic, and certainly more passionate than it ever was before.
So let me take that question and address one which I think is a commonplace among Democrats, in particular liberal Democrats in places like Cambridge, which is, to the surprise of many Democrats, it appears that Franklin Roosevelt has been reborn, lifted from the dead, and is currently again reoccupying the White House. And when we look over long cycles of American presidential politics, we see that one or the other party has a tendency to dominate the White House's membership for periods that can run anywhere from 30 to 50 years. I mean, there was a period between Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt in which only 2 Democrats were elected. Then between Roosevelt and Reagan, there were only 2 Republicans elected. And we've now seemed to be, in many people's eyes, among Democrats, coming to the end of that long Reagan cycle and in the midst of the birth of a new long Democratic cycle. Is that a subject of discussion among Midwestern Republicans, among the people that you're talking with? Is it something that they fear? Is it something that they consider mythological, part of the myth structure that the coastal elites are constantly trying to impose?
I would say that it's a lot of the former, and with a caveat, however. So in the last 3 or 4 weeks prior to Election Day, I was just on sort of a world tour, different city every day, stopping in local Democratic HQ, local Republican HQ, talking with as many organizers and county officials as I could, just trying to get a sense of what was happening on the ground in the 4 or 5 states around me here in Michigan. And the feeling among most Republicans, not all, but among most Republicans, was that they were preparing, they would tell you, for doomsday on November 3rd, that they were bracing for a wipeout. And they believed that for a whole host of reasons. It was Trump's handling of the pandemic. It was sort of his general ineptitude and sort of carelessness and callousness in office. It was turning off suburban women. It was this question of, you know, these disaffected Democrats, blue collar workers who came out and voted for him in 2016. Will they come back out, or will some of them go back to, you know, into the Democratic column? There was a whole host of reasons. And obviously in the back of all of their minds, Richard, is this cold realization that, you know, in 2016, Trump won the presidency by a combined 77,744 votes in the 3 states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That's an awfully thin margin for error, right? And so how do you replicate that? And so there was a real sense among many of the more realistic Republicans I would speak with that they believed that Trump might just get the doors blown off of him. And if that happened, then they would sort of go back to the drawing board and that they would be able to think critically and, you know, soberly about what they do to sort of build on some of these successes they have made with middle and working class Americans, but really address some of the real deficiencies exposed by the Trump era. And for a lot of those Republicans, the result of this election was the very worst case scenario, right? Because what you see is, yes, Trump loses, but he also turns out 6 million more voters than he had in 2016.
Right.
He performs much better among some of these very demographic groups that the Republicans had been struggling with, namely Hispanics and working class Black voters. And so Republicans are in this sort of very strange phase now where they don't quite know what the future holds, but they do know that there can't be any sort of clean breakage from Trump, either from the man himself or from some of the policies that were synonymous with his time in office, because they believe that, listen, even though Democrats are in control of government right now, you've got a 50-50 Senate, you've effectively got a 50-50 House. Nancy Pelosi's got a 4-seat cushion in the House, and you have Republicans at the local level. And this is the point I would really emphasize, Richard, because again, I can't say this enough times. The folks in Washington, the folks at the party committees, certainly the members themselves, they're taking their cues from what they see on the ground. And any Republican you talk to, local, state Republicans who are plugged in, they'll tell you that they haven't seen enthusiasm and organization and grassroots engagement like this since the mid to late 1980s. And so they, even some of them, I mean, I was having a long conversation last night with a good source of mine, a high-ranking Republican in a state party, a key battleground state. This is somebody who loathes Donald Trump and who almost lost his job when some public comments came out, the things he had said about Donald Trump. But he is very clear-eyed about the challenges facing the party. And he said to me, listen, I don't know how, he said, you know, the first thing I did after November 3rd or November 8th, whenever it was, you know, the networks called the election for Biden. So the first thing I did was I went around the office and I took out all the Trump signs and all the Trump, you know, stand up cardboard things. He said, because I wanted to signal to the staff coming in that Monday that it was a new day and it was time to move forward. And he said, and they almost threw my ass out of the building when they came in on Monday. And they went and they got all the signs and they put them right back up. And he said, the point I'm trying to make to you is, this is ultimately a business of addition and multiplication, not of subtraction and division. And for as much as we may loathe this guy, some of us, we also have to acknowledge that if we try to sort of throw him overboard, then we're probably also turning our backs on millions of voters who we're going to need if we're going to be competitive and viable in the next national election.
Tim, I have several questions, but I also feel a responsibility as the host to turn to Liz Schwartz now, who's monitoring chat, and I'm sure that we're building up a lot of questions in this audience. So let me hold off on my questions for now. Liz, can you give us a couple of the lead questions that have shown up in the chat room?
Sure. Yes, we do have a bunch of great questions. I might try to combine two, so let's see how this goes. So Christina Pazany has asked about the narrative after 2016 that the press missed the white economic anxiety in the Rust Belt and other red and purple states. She says, but we saw that in 2020, Trump won among $100,000 plus incomes, and in the January 6th insurrection was populated by many self-employed business owners, middle and upper middle class and upper class whites, not the struggling or unemployed. She asked, how is that disparity explained? And then sort of relatedly, Roger Wilson also mentions the peak of the KKK's power in the 1920s scared the elites of both parties. And he asked, will the latter day KKK movement frighten the governing class of the Republican Party? So it's sort of getting into like, who is actually leading the party? Where's the power base here? And is it really working class, you know, economically depressed white folks, or is it something else going on?
Yeah, so good questions and complicated answers to both. And let me just say, you know, there was this big debate and a lot of kind of snarky back and forth that I felt wasn't terribly productive after 2016 on this question of economic anxiety. Some people sort of throwing themselves fully into that argument that, you know, we don't understand how the forces of deindustrialization and automation and outsourcing have ravaged these communities, and how that can cause people's voting behaviors to change rather abruptly and rather, in some cases, disturbingly. And other people would say, no, that's just, you know, you're just giving aid and comfort to a lot of racists who want to call their racism by another name. And I think that, as with many things in life, two things can be true at the same time, and that there is actually some not insignificant degree of overlap, and that there are also some people who fall very squarely in one camp but not in the other. I think it's an enormous mistake for any of us to dismiss the, you know, we'll call it economic anxiety, call it suffering, call it whatever you want to call it. For my first story that I wrote at the Atlantic, which is in next month's magazine, I drove down to Nelsonville, Ohio. And there's this beautiful old historic opera house in Nelsonville, Ohio, right in the middle of the downtown square. It is a beautiful brick building that's been around since the mid-19th century. And the surrounding blocks around this world-class theater where the Columbus Symphony Orchestra has played, it's just this marvelous venue. And the surrounding blocks around it are some of the most depressed and decrepit that you've ever seen. And part of the success of this opera house, as the guy who runs the place was telling me, and I quoted him on this in the piece, and it would probably upset some people. He said, look, we're an hour away from Columbus, and there's an awful lot of wealthy people in Columbus who want to come down here and go slumming in Southeast Ohio and see what it's like down here and say that they saw an opera show down in Appalachia. And I can tell you from spending a few days down there that A, that's true, what he said, but B, that when you talk with some of these people who as recently as 15 or 20 years ago had really good jobs and had a really stable community and had good schools, and they had a lot of local mom and pop stores that were open, and they felt like they really had a stable way of life. And 20 years later, they are all on government assistance. They are burying their children almost weekly from opioid overdoses. Kids are dropping out of school. This is an incredibly dark and discouraging thing that we have to grapple with. And so to dismiss any of these people and their concerns as just being a sort of thinly veiled excuse for racism, I don't know that that's fair. On the other hand, as I said, at the outset, Richard, 15, 20 minutes back, I do believe that racial resentment, racial grievance, feelings of nativism are deeply entrenched in the psyche of the Republican Party and of the conservative base of the Republican Party at this moment. And it's something that, if history teaches us anything, it's going to take a very long time to work that out of the psyche. If you study the world over, in the aftermath of any great economic depression or recession, it's not unusual to see a 10, 15, 20-year cycle of massive spikes in nativism and isolationism and a fear of outsiders and, let's just look within and try and take care of each other. So it's not terribly unusual. But I think to the second question that Liz asked, and I'm sorry if I'm sort of patching these answers together, I think that the Republican elected class, not all of them, because there are some real knuckle draggers, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the Republican elected class. But I do think that by and large, many of these Republicans understand exactly how dark and how dangerous these forces are and how they have begun to gain a foothold in the Republican Party's imagination and even in its sort of practical work that it does on a daily basis. The problem is, and this is the age-old problem in representative government, that most of these folks do not dare to do anything or say anything that could alienate them from their constituents. Most of these folks realize that they've got the best job they're ever going to have, and they're going to do whatever they need to do to keep it, which is why in the aftermath of November 3rd, when there was a 2-month stretch of time where there were, scores of court cases seen by or overseen by Trump-appointed judges, and there were dozens and dozens of investigations and inquiries led by Republicans at the local and state level, all of which turned up nothing to substantiate any meaningful voter fraud. And yet, every week I would be in conversations with some of these members of Congress saying, listen, you've got tens of thousands of your constituents in your backyards who are calling for blood and filling Facebook feeds and Twitter messages and sending death threats to journalists because they believe this election was stolen. All of the evidence in front of you is telling you that this election was not stolen. Why won't you speak up and say anything? And most of these folks in their private moments will tell you, because I'm scared of them. I'm scared of these people, right? I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my life. I don't want to endure death threats to my wife and children for just having the courage and the decency and the honesty to come out and say, listen, the president's lying to you, right? This isn't a real thing. He's making this up. So finding a way, Richard, and Liz, to wrap up this long rambling answer, finding a way to incentivize our elected leaders to tell their constituents what they don't want to hear is, I believe, the great political challenge of our day. And it's always been a political challenge, but I think because of the forces now of asymmetrical media and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Fox News and Mark Levin and the late Rush Limbaugh filling the heads of so many of these constituents day in and day out with these conspiracy theories and with these outright lies and calls to violence and certainly calls to sort of insurgence and rebellion. You need a countervailing force, a strong countervailing force to push back on that, and we just don't have it right now. And I don't see one emerging anytime soon, unfortunately.
Liz, let's take another question. Thank you, Tim.
Again, two sort of related questions. One, Michael Fisher asks, how do we get past this moment when members of each party see the opposing parties as an existential threat, there we go, to the future of America? And Miles Rappaport asks, if Biden and the Democrats actually deliver economically for working class communities and families, will that threat dislodge significant numbers of Republicans from Trumpism?
I'll take the second part first. I don't know, and honestly, I'm not optimistic on that front, because for a long time you had some pretty good indicators as far as what would correlate to a voting behavior. And of course, you know, the famous James Carville, "It's the economy, stupid" line has been regurgitated a million times over. And in fact, if we've seen anything during the last couple of elections, at least at one pole of the spectrum here, socioeconomically, it's that it's anything but the economy, stupid. The number of high earners who broke ranks and voted against Republican for the first time in their lives was pretty astonishing. Now, is it true that the majority of those folks are still voting Republican? Yes, absolutely. But I don't think it's any small thing to recognize that in Ozaukee County, Wisconsin, where a Democrat has never broken 38%, I believe, of the vote in a presidential election, that Joe Biden got 43% there in a very, very wealthy, affluent, white county north of Milwaukee. Now, that's only a 5-point difference, but again, these margins matter a lot. We also saw Biden's, just for good measure, we saw Biden's numbers tick up significantly in Waukesha County and in Washington County, the other two big suburban affluent counties outside of Milwaukee. Here in Michigan, in Oakland County, the large 75% white, very affluent county just outside of Detroit, where most of the commuters and the white collar executives live, Trump's performance there was a low water mark for any Republican nominee, and I want to say over 40 years. I'd have to double check that. So we are seeing a significant amount of movement in some of these areas that would defy our sort of conventional understanding of economic security, economic status, and economic performance correlating to political behaviors. So will we see that at the other end of the spectrum is the real question. And I believe that we've already begun to see it a little bit. I don't think, to answer the question concisely, which as you'll see, I consistently fail to do, I don't think that we will necessarily see a boom under the Biden administration over the next 18 to 24 months. I don't know that we'll see it help Democrats in the midterm. And I really don't know that we'll see it help Democrats in the 2024 general election. There's any number of reasons for that. But simply put, what we've seen, and I talk about this in my book quite a bit, what we've seen in the last, I'd say 15 years of Republican politics, but really accelerated and concentrated in the last 7 or 8 years of Republican politics, is a willingness of an awful lot of voters to, I'll give you a great example of this. We saw this in Missouri. We saw this in Utah. We saw it in 2 or 3 other states. Voters splitting their tickets, voting for Trump or voting for another Republican, but also voting to expand Medicare, right? And so there's an understanding in some of these cases that on a very concrete, easily digestible, sort of black and white policy question in front of them, that people will sort of make that policy decision in a narrow way. But when they broaden it out and it's a political decision, those same self-interests, economically and otherwise, will tend to take a backseat to some of their major self-interests culturally and religiously and otherwise. And I'm sorry, Liz, I think I went so long, I forgot the first part of that.
No problem. The other question was just, how do we get past this moment where folks in either party see the other as an existential threat?
Listen, this is one of these, this is the simplest answer in the world, but it's the hardest thing in the world to do. You've got to elect better people. And I have given 1 million speeches on Congress in the last 10 years, and I always come back to the same point. Anybody who spends more than about 48 hours wandering the halls of Congress and sort of embedding themselves in the place and talking with members, watching members up close, just observing them, you walk away stunned at the caliber of individual that we send to Washington, D.C. And this gets back to my point a minute ago about the unwillingness of some of these people to just speak hard truths to their constituents. Everybody understands that we've got some problems in this country that could be solved rather easily if you had people who were willing to operate in good faith and with some intellectual honesty. The immigration issue, as thorny as it may appear, is actually relatively straightforward, and Republicans and Democrats have been inches away for 2 decades on solving this question. The reason they can't solve it is because you have too many members in both parties who are unwilling to go home and have to explain a really hard vote to their constituents. And that sort of breeds this sort of, not only does it breed, ineffectual governing, but it breeds this sort of zero-sum, it's their fault, they poisoned the well, they're unwilling to work with us, mentality that sort of pervades the institution right now. So the best thing you could do, to get even a little bit more granular, the best thing you could do for American democracy right now is figure out a way to break up as many of these districts as humanly possible into 50-50 or close to 50 competitive congressional districts, because it's not a coincidence that the very best members of Congress, in my experience, like clockwork, the very best members of Congress, the people who are smart and competent and reasonable and pragmatic and are there to get a job done, they 9.5 times out of 10, they hail from a district that is highly competitive come November. And the fact of the matter is that right now, folks, I'm stunned at how many people fail to appreciate this. 9 out of 10 congressional districts in America today, they are loyally locked down by one of 2 parties. They are not competitive in a general election environment. And what makes it even worse than it might sound on the surface is that, as I alluded to earlier, the primary elections in these districts then become tantamount to general elections. Whoever wins the primary goes to Washington. And the incentive structure that accompanies that system, where you know that if you can just hang on and win a primary, that your seat in Congress is secure. And furthermore, that governing now is basically the same as campaigning, right? Because in a campaign, if you're competing in a primary, you know that you can't afford to allow any daylight to your right. And it's the same thing now governing. You understand, I mean, look at these folks who voted to impeach President Trump, right? These 10 House Republicans. Some of them are from very safe, deep red Republican districts, and they are not going to be back in Congress, right? We know that. That's the way this works. So I'm giving probably more than, more than you can chew off here. But I think if you were to look at the way we draw districts and the sort of system that breeds, that's the single biggest problem in American politics today. And everything we see, I believe, in as far as the dysfunction in government and even some of the dysfunction in society is downstream of that.
Tim, I'm looking at our audience and realizing that at 1, we're starting to lose people to more classes. So what I'm going to do is stop us now and say this has been absolutely terrific. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone on board. And if you want to signal with a little wave of the hand your appreciation for Tim, Alberta, I wish you would. This has been really enlightening. It's a skillful weaving of your experience in Washington and also your good, strong sense of where Midwestern America is today and where we're going in terms of both parties. So let me thank you, Tim, Alberta, for joining us. Let me also hope that your wife is feeling better very quickly and that the kids can get through this period with her not feeling so good because of COVID.
Well, Richard, I'm very appreciative for you all having me, and I can promise you that she's already feeling better because she gets to brag to her friends and her family that her husband was in some way affiliated with Harvard. So I may even go online and order a sweatshirt now that I can wear around the house, just so people know.
This has been an honor for us. Believe me, Harvard is capable of learning from non-Harvard, even though we don't like to admit it. So
well, thank you so much for having me, folks. I really appreciate it.
Really good to have you, Tim.
Take
and
care.
Look forward to the Atlantic article.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be out soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye now.